workers, so the wage and salary workers, there may be lack of knowledge, there may be organizational problems, so the small and medium enterprises which need to organize the administration to do all the paperwork, and this is very cumbersome. Low level of inspection control, low credibility of the institution. Sometimes the worker doesn't see a reason why to save, and why shouldn't the money be paid out, and I could use it. So sometimes an agreement is made with the employer, and okay, so you save a part of the contribution, I get a part of the, so it's, and then there are also the situations where the employers, they do not offer a formal job, so they offer an informal job, and it's a case for inspection. Then the case of the self-employed, usually it's more difficult to access. It is difficult to get the knowledge about how the system works. Sometimes the affiliation is voluntary. Lots of countries in Latin America have had over the last decades voluntary affiliation of the self-employed, but these countries are all changing one after the other. Step by step they are changing from voluntary to mandatory affiliation in the case of the self-employed. Sometimes you have the phenomenon of hidden employees, that is somebody who is actually a wage worker, but he or she is registered, has a work contract as if it was an independent worker. Let's say you dismiss a person and you rehire that person as a self-employed. So it's a fake self-employed actually. Then the problem of the double contribution, because there is no employer to share the contribution, and sometimes these persons, they give priority to their own small business. In the case of rural workers, usually lack of knowledge is an extremely big problem, because the information doesn't disseminate to rural areas. It's more easily available in urban areas. Inspection and control is a big problem in rural areas because of the territory. So to cover the number of rural establishments, you need a bigger number of inspectors. Quite often problems of child work and even slave work. And I think that one of the main problems for rural workers, which you certainly have seen as well in your countries, is that workers in agriculture, they do not have a regular income. So the income depends on the harvest. Yes, so you have an income once or twice a year. And sometimes the harvest is good, sometimes the harvest is not good. There is a catastrophe, climatic problem, or the fisherman, the fish stock is overfished, so the sea is overfished, so they cannot have the same income as before. So on what basis to charge contributions? This is, I think, one of the key questions for rural workers, especially for the self-employed. Then in the case of the domestic workers, there in Latin America we have very much problems of child labor. Most countries, they had no mandatory affiliation, but now they are changing. Also with Convention 189, they are changing to compulsory affiliation. The atomization, the fragmentation of the domestic workers Usually there is no trade union or an association which helps organize or fight for the rights of these persons. It doesn't help, and sometimes there is big discrimination, because, well, at least in Brazil, domestic work is black. So you have an ethnic difference. So the employer is white, and the domestic worker is black. Usually it's like that. So there is an asymmetry. There is a power situation, and a certain discrimination. And this sometimes associated with a migrant background, which weakens the domestic worker, because the domestic worker comes from another region of the country, or sometimes comes from another country. So it weakens even more the domestic worker if the domestic worker wants to ask for some basic rights, and among them the affiliation to Social Security. And another problem which we quite often see in Latin American countries is that the laws and the legal processes, the justice, how the justice judges, doesn't favor domestic workers very much. So it's cumbersome. It's difficult to appeal in some countries. There are no easy or direct ways of settling of setting a claim, and justice. It's not very often that justice really condemns the employer, because the employer has much more, let's say, power to produce arguments than the domestic worker. So there is really an asymmetry, and it is important to work on that. I'm not going through all these. Maybe you could look at this. Some of the issues we have already mentioned: improve image, Social Security education programs, improve the customer attention, and so on. There are lots of ideas. But I think that it's basically there is no simple solution. There will be a set of policies which will have to be taken within the institution to develop a unified approach to the problems. And in the case of the self-employed, our lessons there in Latin America have been mandatory coverage. It has increased. If you make a little effort in database, in comparison of different databases, in tracking, if you make a little effort in auditing, if you improve your registration processes, and if you transform the voluntary into mandatory coverage, you double or triple the coverage of the self-employed. So countries which have voluntary coverage in Latin America, during the period they had voluntary coverage of the self-employed, it was around 5% coverage. After transforming it into mandatory, or those countries which already have mandatory coverage for a longer period, they have around maybe 15 to 20%. Or 30% in some cases. Uruguay has reached high levels of coverage as well. Sure.
How is it made mandatory? With the self-employed, who contributes to voluntary? What policies are put in place to make it mandatory?
Then, in that case, you will need to introduce some form of subsidy at least for the most vulnerable ones. You can design packages of benefits. There, in the case of Brazil, we designed a package where you have an old age pension and a length of service pension. So the length of service pension is after 35 years of contribution at any age. And the old age pension is at age 60 for women or 65 for men. So in the case of the self-employed who contribute at a lower contribution rate, they retire by age but not by length of contribution. So and this makes it actuarially feasible, sustainable.